Welcome back to another episode of the Misdiagnosed Podcast. I'm your host, Kaylin Pyle, and we're picking back up with the Brain Saver book from medical medium Anthony William. We're going to skip chapter 6. It's about inflamed cranial nerves. It's a short chapter, and the gist of it is that your cranial nerves, including your trigeminal and your vagus nerves, which are kind of buzzwords these days, like, oh, your vagus nerve is inflamed. It has to do with the viruses that we've talked about in previous episodes. So it all kind of, I think that's why it's a short chapter too, because it just is connected. Viruses can excrete those neurotoxins that can aggravate those nerves, and that's the root cause of the inflammation. Inflammation is such a buzzword. If you go on TikTok, and I've spent a significant amount of time on TikTok watching videos from people who are talking about it's inflammation. That's the cause. But what's the cause of the inflammation? Like, you have to go deeper. And so that's why I appreciate medical medium's information so much, because it goes beyond just that surface, buzzy explanation that people have settled for. And that's kind of the topic of today's episode. We're going to start chapter 7. It's called Your Burnt Out Deficient Brain. And really interesting stuff, because burnout is another one of those things that's been thrown around like a buzz term, to the point where people don't want to hear that the cause of their issues is burnout, because it's just not a real answer, right? Anthony gives a really good analogy. You know how much I love Anthony's analogies. He says to picture a swimming pool with water draining out while at the same time fresh water is flowing in to the pool from a hose. And you want to take a swim in the pool. You're really, really hot. You're sweaty. You really want to cool off. But the water is draining out of the pool faster than it's filling up. That analogy is what he uses to describe how it works when supplies can't get to our brain faster than our brain is using our supplies up. So if nutrients, phytochemical compounds, antiviral compounds, antibacterial compounds, macro minerals, trace minerals, mineral salts, vitamins, glucose, electrolytes, coenzymes, alkaloids, antioxidants, anthocyanins, I butchered that word, anthocyanins, polyphenols, and neurotransmitter chemicals leave the brain faster than we put them back into the brain, our brain cannot function optimally. So it's like I always say, if your brain doesn't have what it needs to function, then it's not going to function properly, and then you're going to get mental illness symptoms, right? Doctors just don't seem to get that. They receive so little information. And if you listen to the episode with Dr. Kendra Campbell, you'll know that is 100% the truth, that they are indoctrinated. They're not educated. They're brainwashed into believing that these imbalances caused by deficiencies are genetic, and that the answer is a pill, when that's not true at all. Deficiencies is the foundation of burnout, really. I mean, supply and demand. If there is more demand than there is supply, and you're not giving your brain what it needs because you don't know that that's what it needs, then you're going to experience burnout. And the medical industry loves to avoid the real problems, the true issues that are causing people's illnesses, chronic illnesses. They love to have burnout as the reason, basically slapping it as a label on a bunch of different things. But yeah, like I said, people don't want to hear that burnout is the cause of their problems anymore. It's kind of like how hearing that your problems are because of your genes, it's really the same sort of thing. It's not really an explanation. And medical research and science don't really have real explanations for chronic illness. So burnout will just serve as a scapegoat for them. And it's real. Don't get me wrong, it's real. But what's missing from the medical explanation is what it is and exactly how it works. Alternative medicine, well-meaning as they are, still believes that autoimmune disease is the body attacking itself. And that's a concept that it adopted from listening to conventional medicine. And it's still a theory. It's not proven, but they act like it has been proven. So that means both alternative and conventional medicine believe that autoimmune is our fault. So if we have an autoimmune disorder, it's our fault, like it's the genes or whatever. And burnout is another term for it being our fault. And it means that we're just weak. We can't handle the heat and we have to take a vacation, or we're inferior somehow. We might be telling someone else about our symptoms, to which we get a response like, oh, you're just burnt out. We just got to get somebody else to do the job. They're not affected by burnout. They're stronger than you. You know, those kind of implications come through in the way others treat us, because the world doesn't understand what burnout is and how it works and how it happens. I can see now, looking back, how I was definitely burnt out and had no idea, because I wasn't connecting the dots between the last couple of years of my life and how hard I had worked and how much I had taxed taxed my system and how little back I had put into the system in comparison. And I wasn't understanding why I wasn't able to perform at the same level as I used to. It was because I didn't understand the concept of supply and demand when it came to burnout. So I was just like, this is just, I didn't have any other explanation for it. And when you get to the point where you're like, oh gosh, it's burnout, you think, oh, I finally got an answer, but it only makes sense for about an hour, maybe a day or two, a week. But the burnout diagnosis isn't satisfying after a while, because then you're starting to ask the questions, why am I burnt out? And how come I can't handle what somebody else can handle? And really what's happening is that burnout puts the focus on the surface of the issue versus what's actually happening deeper inside. It shouldn't be a sole diagnosis. We should be diagnosed with the deeper issues at hand, which are viral inflammation, toxic heavy metals, and other poisons and solvents, like our cleaning products, MSG deposits, lack of glucose because we're all afraid of fruit, lack of mineral salts, neuron injury, neurotransmitter deficiencies, adrenal complications, and vices that were brought upon us by drug pushers like the caffeine industry. Yeah, and coming up here in the next couple of episodes, we're going to hit caffeine real hard. I was going to do it this episode, but I was like, wait a second. It didn't make any sense because this chapter is kind of the bedrock of being able to really understand all the concepts in the caffeine chapter. But it is one hell of a chapter, and I'm looking forward to it. There's also a chapter on alcohol that will tie into this as well, so maybe I will follow up with both of those chapters. It'll just depend. We'll see how it goes. But for now, we're talking about burnout. It's a complex interplay of a lot of different factors that cause us to run low on what our brains need to sustain us and keep us strong. And I'll say it again, I'm a broken record, I know that. But if you don't have what you need for your brain to function properly, it is not going to function properly. And then you're going to get symptoms, not just mental health symptoms, right? Mental illness symptoms. Beyond that, you're going to get other physical symptoms because your brain is the command center for your entire body. And so everything is connected to your brain. It's your motherboard. Think of yourself as a biological supercomputer. That's been helpful to me to understand, like, okay, well, if I don't feel good today, what did I eat yesterday? How have I been really taking care of myself? Am I hydrated? Does my brain have what it needs? Because if it doesn't, then chances are that's why I've got this stinking thinking going on. It's definitely connected to it. So yeah, the brain is the motherboard. It's a complex electrical grid. Not everything has to be perfect. We have room to play if we have the supplies that we need. And if we've got reserves, then we have room to make mistakes and the brain can hang. You know what I mean? So when the supplies are low and they're low for too long, restoring the brain with what it needs doesn't happen in a day or a week. It takes time. That's why they say it takes between 3 to 5 years to recover from burnout, right? It took me 3 to 5 years to probably deplete all my resources when I got really stressed with my work and divorce and everything. I'm really on the up and up now. I can see a lot in my rear view mirror. I can see that I have healed significantly. Burnout doesn't develop over just a day or a week, and that's why it takes time to heal. It happens before we even see the signs. But once we see the signs, we're already deep in it. You could have a deficiency for multiple years before you ever even see the signs of burnout. It reminds me of Alzheimer's disease. You may not see any symptoms, but you still have the deficiencies for anywhere between 15 to 30 years before you really start seeing the signs. Burnout can happen even when we're not really stressed or up against any trials or hardship, heavy workloads, or major demands, because it has so much to do with deficiencies. And we can experience deficiencies even when our life is pretty peaceful if we don't have the proper knowledge and tools to fuel and support ourselves. Burnout's all about whether we can get it in, those nutrients and supplies, faster than those nutrients and supplies are leaving. Yeah, and when our brain doesn't have the supplies it needs, that's when we suffer. But avoiding the fact that our brain is deficient isn't necessarily clear cut. It's not as simple as making sure we're feeding our brain what it really needs. It's certainly a critical part of the equation, making sure that we have the bioavailable nutrients in our diets. It's not the whole formula for why we experience the brain deficiencies that lead to burnout and put our health at risk. We also have to ask the question, are we supplying our brains and bodies with enough of the right components to balance out the demands of all the stressors in our lives? It doesn't matter what stressors these are. They could be minor or intense emotional events, physical output, so a lot of intense exercise, exercise, for example, deadlines at the office, or even having COVID, the flu, or something else, is our brain getting enough support to power through, recover, and replenish its reserves? Our bloodstream works to deliver important building blocks to the brain, and many of those diminish before they can even get that far. That's because there's other organs and glands that are also desperate for attention. If they're in deficit, they're going to draw from the precious cargo that's heading up to the brain. So all of that factors into the formula. We got to think about our body on a systemic level too. Sometimes it's not even about nutrients themselves or nutritional building blocks of brain hormones, because without realizing it, we could be fostering an environment within our body that undermines our best intentions. And there's a future episode about acid in the brain. We're talking a lot about hydration there. So that's something to look forward to. And we learned about in the episodes about the emotional brain how bad chronic dehydration can be. Then we also have to consider oxygen. How oxygenated is our blood? Do we have enough oxygen? It's that whole balance. So is the rest of our body functioning well enough to support our brain? Is our liver sluggish because it has a lot of fat to process because we're eating a high protein, high fat diet? Is there a viral load in the liver? What about other toxins that we encounter in the world? So, for example, if I were still eating a lot of Taco Bell and Pizza Hut, I would be full of toxins on a consistent basis. And over time, that would clog up my liver because it would be a ton of dairy, a ton of genetically modified ingredients going into my body constantly. Those are toxins and they can slow down the liver. And a slow liver means that it has less of an ability to store and convert nutrients into bioavailable forms for the brain. Its ability to do that is diminished when it's slow and stagnant because of all the things that we're putting into it, knowingly or unknowingly, right? Excess fat in our bloodstream, if we're on a high-fat diet, which are really trendy right now, even if it's healthy fat, it's still going to create a form of insulin resistance, preventing cells from getting the glucose that it needs. Sugar, the good kind, from fruit, brings nutrients into brain cells. Fat does not bring nutrients into brain cells. And Anthony says that there's one foundational truth that you can get a blood test to measure your nutrient levels and get results showing everything in the healthy range, and your brain could still be deficient. Isn't that surprising? A lot of us, including myself, have historically relied upon blood tests to say, oh, everything's normal, but the normal range could be really detrimental. Vitamin D is one that comes to mind. Like they say a normal level is between 30 and 100 milligrams per dry liter, I believe, of vitamin D. Come to find out that a level of 60 and higher is where the benefits of having enough vitamin D come into play. Yeah, so having too much fat in the blood, nutrients can get suspended around that fat in your blood and trapped in the bloodstream, and they lose their efficacy there, and eventually it gets urinated out. That's why it's so important, especially when you're cleansing, which I've been doing more of lately, really focusing on keeping the amount of fat in my diet down, because I want to put all the nutrients that I can into my organs and really make sure they're replenished. And I totally notice a difference. And we also need to think about what else we may be doing that can counteract the benefits of all the good stuff we try to put into ourselves. For example, a lot of trendy things out there: baking soda, charcoal, clay treatments that you take internally with a good intention, but misguided intention to treat candida because it's a theory that'll help the brain receive nutrients, actually do just the opposite because they suffocate the intestinal lining, blocking it from absorbing nutrients that would otherwise be delivered to the brain to support its functioning. I do have some activated charcoal in my apothecary, in my pantry, but I only save it for when I have something stomach related going on. I bought it because I was experiencing so much bloating and I hadn't put all the pieces together yet, hadn't even uncovered any of the medical medium information. And I was reading about all these trends online. Oh, activated charcoal is good for gas. Activated charcoal is good for your gut. It'll take all the toxins out, blah, blah, blah. And it can help when you have like an acute problem with gas. I mean, that's the only time I would drink baking soda too, is to alleviate really painful gas, but it wasn't getting to the reason I was experiencing so much gas. And in an attempt to not take it for granted, I just want to celebrate the fact that I almost never get headaches anymore. Random headaches that seem to come out of nowhere. I remember when I lived in Amsterdam, I would have a headache pretty much constantly, and I can remember pill popping painkillers just for a headache all the time, knowing it wasn't good for me, but also not caring because I was so depressed and suicidal. Just like knew that what I was doing to myself wasn't good and not caring. but also not knowing what to do about it, you know? And I used to have gas all the time. Like, it was just a way of life to have really painful bloating and gas. And now it's funny, like when I fart, it's surprising. I'm like, oh, that doesn't happen very often. Like, it just, when you don't have a lot of negative, I say negative, that's not the right word, but counteracting, I guess, is probably a better word to use. Counteracting foods going into your gut, and your gut is healing and able to process things better and not suffering, and your liver is healthier and the amount of fat in your diet is lower, then everything just kind of runs so much more smoothly. I went from having a norm of having a lot of stomach gas and painful bloating, and I used to have to, for hours, force myself to burp because it was so painful, and then I would just drink baking soda because I couldn't take it anymore and burp some more. It was just really, really painful, and having painful headaches and even migraines. But now I can't remember the last time I had a migraine. When I do, I know it's because of something that I can put my finger on, like overstressing, lack of electrolytes, like I wasn't hydrated usually is when I can pinpoint what it is. So what are our brains missing exactly? There's 3 nutritional components that our brain relies upon, and those are glucose, trace minerals, and vitamin B12. That's not the only thing, but those are the top 3. And there's also brain hormones, proper hydration, specific amino acids, antioxidants, macrominerals like magnesium and potassium, phytochemical compounds, coenzymes, alkaloids, anthocyanins, antiviral and antibacterial compounds, and polyphenols. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that properly, but deficiencies in these essentials of brain function are pretty rampant in our world today, and actually are what is laying the foundation for burnout, addiction, memory loss, brain fog, confusion, OCD, been there, phobias, depression, also been there, and focus and concentration issues, right? Like ADHD symptoms. People don't have what they need in their brains for them to function properly, and they're calling it ADHD. And like, that's such a huge cult right now. Everybody has ADHD and they're freaking out, and there's such a strong destigmatization around it, which I used to be kind of a part of. Like, oh, women are underdiagnosed and I've had these symptoms all my life and it's genetic, and I believed all that for a long time. But then when I really started to take care of my brain in a way that I know I wasn't before I saw the symptoms dissipate, and I was like, wow, there's more to this than that. And amphetamine salts is not the answer, okay? Not taking Adderall for the rest of my life, all right? Just not doing it. So the focus of what our brains are missing is really on glucose, trace minerals, salts, B12, hormones, and hydration, because without these components, the deeper problems like toxic heavy metals and other brain-betraying toxins can do more damage. Looking at glucose first, glucose is a form of sugar. It's not exactly a nutrient, but we can call it a nutrient. It's different from vitamins, minerals, trace minerals, and other nutritional components that support our brain and body. So what makes glucose different is that glucose is an actual food source for the brain. Your brain runs on glucose. It cools brain cells and brain tissue. Our brains are meant to be very well stocked with glycogen, which is stored glucose, as a backup for when we go without the fresh supplies of it for too long. But too often, our glycogen storage gets eaten away and it gets depleted. Intermittent fasting, when it's done the wrong way with a lot of caffeine and no available glucose for hours, is one wrong way to do it. It causes our glycogen stores to get eaten away and depleted because you're running on adrenaline, which is just going to lead to burnout. With our glucose and trace mineral salt reserves low, our brain fire burns high because adrenaline takes over and becomes the fuel for our motherboard. A lack of glucose reserves makes it a lot easier for emotional shock, whether that's big issues or smaller shock waves, bad news, mild betrayal, makes us more susceptible to all of that. And as we were learning in the episodes on the emotional brain, if we don't have enough glucose to cool down the brain, when we're up against emotional struggles like that, our brain tissues can get scorched, leading to calluses and scar tissue. No bueno. That's really what the experience of burnout is. But we know also that, very fortunately, brain tissue can heal and recover and return. It just takes the right tools and it takes time. And truly, it takes an appreciation for how our brain really works. That's why it's great that you're listening to this. And it's been really valuable to be going through this book again, too, because it's reminding me of things that I want to keep in mind. Like, I had forgotten, for example, that glucose is not really a nutrient, that it's a food source, and that it cools our brain cells and brain tissue. tissue. That's why fruit is so important. And then another deficiency those top three, I think he's going to go into four, but the second one, we just went over the first one, which is glucose deficiency. The second one is trace mineral salt deficiency. So electrical conductors are another important part of our brain's function because electrolytes serve as conductors in the brain, and trace mineral salts are the building blocks of the electrolytes. So it's all a little happy family. Trace mineral salts are part of a foundation of the brain. Trace minerals in the brain are more critical than essential fatty acids. Electricity can't run through our brain without them. This not to be confused with adding salt to food. The trace mineral salts are something completely different, and we'll get into that later. Not all electrolytes are the same either. What Anthony calls come and go electrolytes, they get used up and disappear, traveling out of the brain or getting vaporized by electrical currents, and they are made up of macro minerals like potassium, magnesium, and sodium. Those are the foundational electrolytes. Trace mineral salts are the building blocks of the foundational electrolytes, and they cling to neurotransmitters and help prevent them from dehydrating. These electrolytes don't cause extreme and explosive heating, but they help the neurotransmitter reflect heat, kind of like a shield. These electrolytes that are made up of trace mineral salts don't get used up within a second. They can be active for a much longer duration of time. Electrical impulses in the brain can only run with continuity if there's a steady stream of electrolytes and trace mineral salts. If there's an area of the brain where electrolytes and trace mineral salts are completely missing, then the electrical charge will diminish greatly in that area of the brain. As a result, someone could experience going blank and losing their thought, which happens so much. They had a thought, and now it feels like it's in the back of their mind, and they're trying to retrieve it. Brain cells are different from any other cells in the body. Brain nerve cells are different from any other nerve cells in the body. They require a lot of trace minerals to do their job. Other nerve cells in the body don't require as many trace minerals. I actually started taking trace mineral drops in my water, just adding it to my tinctures every day. We got to keep in mind, too, that salt is not the same as trace mineral salts that are bioavailable and have other minerals bonded to them. So just consuming plain salt, no bueno. It's basically the same as consuming processed sugar. Processed sugar is not the right kind of sugar the brain needs. It's missing most of its nutrient content, mineral content, and becomes something different inside the body. And processed salt is the same. It doesn't have the trace mineral structure around the sodium. So what occurs when it enters the body is dehydration instead of providing the brain with what it needs. Rock salt and sea salt don't remedy that deficiency either. There's no trace minerals in rock salt or sea salt. So if someone's going to eat salt, they're better off having rock salt and sea salt than regular table salt, but still the salt's composition has changed because they've been isolated and separated from the natural environment. The salts are also too concentrated. Sea salt, for example, is changed because it was removed from its water solution. Ocean salt has more minerals than stripped standard table salt. It still doesn't have an adequate amount of minerals due to its removal from the ocean. Plus, sea salt's concentration, like rock salts, causes salt shock when entering the body, and salt shock alerts the body that there's a problem, making the trace minerals in rock salt and sea salt less bioavailable. And I'm glad I'm reading this because I was putting sea salt on my food up until recently, and so I started doing more of the cleanse. It really makes a difference. The best place to get bioavailable trace mineral salts are places like lemons and celery juice. So squeezing lemon into your water and drinking that throughout the day is one of the best things you can do to get that consistent stream. Starting your day off with celery juice too, which I did. I juiced this morning. I feel good about it. Neurotransmitter hormones. So talking about ADHD, right, which is supposedly a deficiency in neurotransmitter hormones. They actually need trace minerals in order to be complete. So what if all these people that have ADHD or think they have ADHD are simply deficient in neurotransmitter hormones? They don't have enough trace minerals to create them because they work side by side. If you have deficiency of trace minerals inside the brain, it leads to temporary relapses of any type of symptom and condition because electrical activity drives through patchy spots of brain tissue in areas where trace minerals are deficient. So those patchy spots of the brain tissue become the part of the electrical highway of the brain where electricity is dimmer. So think of almost like a flickering street lamp or a string of flickering street lamps, or like a power outage in the neighborhood, like a larger neighborhood, like one street has the power out or something. What it does is creates inconsistency that causes someone to struggle, whether it's in receiving information or expressing themselves, delivering information vocally or writing it. Toxic heavy metals and viral neurotoxins in the brain worsen the effects of this deficiency. Now, the fewer trace minerals there are in the brain, the hotter the brain tissue can become because, again, trace minerals protect brain tissue. Trace minerals control the heat of the brain while glucose cools down the brain. If someone's very deficient and void of many trace mineral salts and therefore electrolytes, it can almost feel like it hurts when they think too hard. Anybody can relate. Just raise your hand. That's because brain cells near the electrical current pathway heat up excessively from the transmission of information because trace minerals are not present in those certain areas to moderate the brain heat. And this overheating of the electrical pathway leads some people to try to remedy the situation by not thinking so hard, by shutting down. Then the brain tissue cools more than it should because when there's a deficiency in trace mineral salts, the brain can't regulate heat well either way. Brain tissue goes from excess heating to excess cooling, even if thoughts are still highly active or intense as someone tries to shut down. Brain heat fluctuations can give somebody fluctuations between clarity and no clarity, or between feeling like they have to think too hard. And then, as a result of trying not to think at all, they start feeling out of it, right, altogether. Excessive heating and cooling take energy away from the electrical grid, away from that motherboard, which essentially takes energy away from the brain. This process is different when someone has ample trace minerals in their brain and they choose to quiet their mind, right, when you go into meditation, for example, because trace mineral salts are there to regulate heat in the brain. That person won't get a drastic fluctuation that leads to the excessive cooling, which means they'll be able to regulate their thoughts with greater ease. Yeah, I think we've mentioned it on the podcast before where you could do all these practices like mindfulness and trying to change your thoughts and neuroplasticity and all this stuff that's super trendy right now. But if your brain is not healthy, not able to do that, then none of it's going to stick and you're going to end up even more frustrated. So you have to start from within in terms of the physical sense. Like, is your instrument, is your brain, is your body as vital and healthy? Does it have everything it needs to process information properly? Yeah, so that is the trace mineral salt deficiency. And then moving on to the third thing, vitamin B12 is another deficiency that can be a problem. It's a necessity for the brain, vitamin B12. A top reason for that is because B12 strengthens brain tissue so that the tissue can survive electricity. Every cell in the brain requires B12 for that cell's survival. It's a required nutrient for brain cells to live longer. B12 is meant to be embedded into brain cell walls, allowing for quick cell repair when brain cells become intoxicated or damaged. And we know by now that our brain gets hot from electricity, and that could be from an emotional challenge or the brainstorm of an emotional conflict. Brain heat may be from problem solving or pressures from work, life, school. Brain heat can come from exercising when your brain is highly alert to every single movement you're making, sending signals to every single muscle throughout your body. Your brain tissue is an engine that's being used. How much B12 is readily available in each cell of your brain determines your brain's recovery from anything that challenges it. For ideal recovery, every single brain cell has to be at 60% or more of its B12 capacity, and that B12 has to be bioavailable. B12 is brain cell soluble. The two organs that receive B12 the most and the most easily are the liver and the brain. If a brain cell is under 60% of its capacity of B12, small damages can occur to that brain cell. On the other hand, if a brain cell is under 30% of its B12 capacity, larger damages occur to it. And if a brain cell is under 5% of its B12 capacity, extreme damage occurs to that brain cell, and the brain cell walls may not be repairable. Now, negative thoughts that are just passing through can't deplete your brain cells of B12. Positive thoughts can't refill your brain cells with B12. But negative experiences like betrayal, broken trust, losses, relationships, world tragedies, they can deplete your brain cells of B12, and even positive experiences can deplete your brain of B12. Happiness, joy, fun, play, for example, ski trips and other active vacations, new relationships, new opportunities, new babies, new jobs, all take B12. If you lose your B12 from your brain cells, you can become played out, burnt out from too much play, and not recover easily. You can become drained from too much fun and need a vacation from your vacation. A difficult emotional struggle can do the same thing. It can burn you out if you're lacking B12 in your brain cells. Recovery is very difficult without ample B12. Very little B12 actually comes from our food. And in fact, B12 deficiencies are about as rampant as zinc deficiencies. And the B12 that you get from eating a piece of meat or egg or cheese or other animal product is not the B12 that enters into your brain cells and allows those brain cells to work at their best capacity. It's very interesting to learn that because so many people that are against eating vegan or eating plant-based are like, well, where are you going to get your B12? Like, it only comes from animal products, blah, blah, blah. So let's continue. The B12 from animals was designed for the animal's brain only. It's a different coenzyme altogether, and it's created for the sole purpose of that animal's brain and not for a human brain. Wow, that makes so much sense. And it's like, okay, yeah, drinking dairy, for example, drinking milk, consuming the hormones of another animal that are meant to grow a baby calf into a gigantic cow, and people wonder why they have weight problems. It's probably not that simple, but all these hormones that we're ingesting are meant for other animals, and it's the same with the vitamins that come from animals are meant for the other animals. A blood test is not going to tell you this information, though. You could even have a blood test that shows you're high in B12, but it's the wrong B12, not to mention that a blood test only measures what's in your blood. There is actually no test that can tell you how much B12 is in a brain cell. It can't tell you what type of B12 is in the brain, if it's usable or not usable, or how much B12 a brain cell is even using. The B12 that you're existing on, that's inside your brain, is still being created from that one piece of parsley you picked out of your garden 10 years ago, and that's thanks to elevated biotics. Elevated biotics are on the foods we grow or buy at the farmer's market. When we eat these foods, elevated biotics go to live in our ileum, which is a section of our small intestine, and they help produce B12. Once B12 is produced in our body, our liver is there to be a storage bin for it. In most food and supplement forms, B12 has to be converted, and the liver does this, to allow methylation to occur. The B12 that our body produces in the ileum from elevated biotics doesn't have to be converted, only stored in the liver. If our liver isn't functioning well, which means we don't store B12 and convert B12 from outside sources to make it more soluble and usable to brain cells, then we become B12 deficient because of our sluggish liver. When we're using our brain, B12 is like a nut or a bolt holding it together, and some people blow through their supplies of B12 faster because of the different experiences and exposures using up their reserves. To some extent, everybody is depleted in B12. Every nerve cell has to have a certain amount of B12, and yet we walk around with nerve cells deficient in it. Many of us walk around with nerve cells at under 30% of their B12 capacity, and we suffer from that. One way we can suffer is burnout. B12 deficiency also plays a role in how fast chronic illness that's neurological in nature can hinder us and how long certain symptoms last. So even after the core root of the chronic illness, like Epstein-Barr virus, is destroyed, the symptoms can still linger because you're in recovery, and nerve recovery can take even longer because of lack of B12. Yeah, so that's the nutshell version of the B12 deficiency in its relation to burnout. Brain hormone deficiency. Many of the hormones in the brain that are involved in communication and feelings of peace and happiness are originally derived from the adrenal glands. Did you know that? Medical research and science haven't even scratched the surface when it comes to the role that the adrenal glands play in our brains. That's fascinating. In addition to producing reproductive hormones, our adrenal glands also produce some varieties of neurotransmitter hormones and hormone chemicals for brain functioning. Burnt out, weak adrenals can create a brain hormone chemical deficiency. So all these people out there on Adderall, on Vyvanse, on all these ADHD medications and drinking coffee all day, whether or not they're on medications is irrelevant. Anybody who's drinking coffee all day is just reaming their adrenal glands, and they're wondering why their brain isn't functioning properly, right? Because your adrenal glands are responsible for creating some varieties of neurotransmitter hormones and chemicals that are paramount for our brain functioning. So those adrenal glands, they get burnt out, they become weak, and they create a brain hormone chemical deficiency. Our liver also has an ability, when it's functioning optimally anyway, to produce some of those brain chemical hormones. But most people aren't living with livers that are functioning optimally, so that means they have a sluggish liver, and that's contributing to their brain hormone deficiencies. And there are neurotransmitter chemical hormones that are meant to be produced inside the brain and can be reproduced over and over again, developed to match specific neurons. So that means when a neuron cell develops, a matching neurotransmitter chemical develops with it. If we're missing the building blocks required for certain neurotransmitter chemical hormones to develop to match certain neurons, we can become deficient in these chemical hormones. enough of them won't develop. The brain actually has a miraculous ability to develop neurons themselves, even when faced with severe deficiencies. There's all kinds of theories of neurotransmitter chemicals being created in the intestinal tract, but they're misguided. In some cases, certain foods that we eat provide neurotransmitter hormones or substantial neurotransmitter building blocks through our gut. Melatonin, for example, is one of the antioxidant brain hormones contained in some foods, like cherries. But that doesn't mean that melatonin comes from our gut. Neurotransmitter chemicals can be delivered through our gut, not produced by our gut. So this whole time, I don't know if you've heard that 90% of your serotonin is produced in your gut. That's actually not true, but I believed that for a long time. The food we eat can become building blocks to support the development of a neurotransmitter chemical compound. The intestinal tract itself, though, does not create the neurotransmitter. Our brain, liver, and endocrine system, including the adrenals, hypothalamus, and pineal gland, contribute to neurotransmitter production, not our gut. Anthony says that we've come to a place of oversimplification and we like to point to our gut for everything. I think that's true. We do. It's the gut. It's the second brain. And while that's true, it works in tandem with the brain. It's not the same thing. People don't know why they're sick, but they think the gut is responsible because alternative medicine is in the process of brainwashing us that our problems all stem from the gut and that our small intestine and colon are responsible for everything happening in our body. And they're brainwashing people because they're brainwashed themselves. It's really what it comes down to. And alternative medicine has people trained to consume lots of coffee and other forms of caffeine, wine, and CBD oil. And plus, people are sharing bodily fluids in relationships. And we have exposures to dangerous chemicals and scented candles and perfume that people choose thinking that they're tools for their self-care. And none of that is considered the problem. Instead, it's all your gut. Coffee is like battery acid and destroys every beneficial living microorganism in your gut, despite any paid-for studies that say otherwise. So if your gut even did produce a neurotransmitter chemical, fat chance it would survive. Fat chance. My mom used to say that all the time. Not to mention that when caffeine and alcohol get into your brain, they damage neurotransmitters in the brain. So how many people with ADHD are drinking coffee all the time or any kind of type of caffeine, energy drinks, especially with the Adderall shortage nationwide right now? How many people are drinking alcohol still? So this oversimplification of the gut is everything kind of dogma, plus the brainwashing that nothing else we're doing is the problem, is a new low in alternative medicine. And it shows how much medical communities are struggling and they're trying to make sense of the wave after wave after wave of people that are wanting help for burnout and other chronic illness symptoms. Yeah, so brain hormone deficiency. The last one we're going to cover before we wrap up this episode is chronic dehydration. Your brain needs to receive water, and it receives the water through our bloodstream. But if your blood is lacking in water, your brain will know. Water in the bloodstream is part of our brain's cooling mechanism, right along with glucose. And you need water in your blood in order to carry the glucose. Water helps thin out the blood so glucose can be carried to your brain in a timely fashion, so your brain doesn't go hungry. So without a proper water level in the bloodstream, glucose won't arrive in the brain at a proper level either, even if you're consuming glucose-rich foods. It really goes both ways because you need glucose for the water to do its job, and the cooling effect of the water on the brain only works when there's enough glucose to carry along with it. So you need both water and glucose in your blood to carry the electrolytes and the trace mineral salts, which are the regulators that allow the brain to function without overheating or becoming overactive or underactive. So when it comes to chronic dehydration, it's not just about whether we're drinking water that contains electrolytes or not. This is about the need for water, period. Drinking water without electrolytes and trace mineral salts doesn't mean the water running through the bloodstream to our brain is void of electrolytes and trace minerals. The water in the bloodstream can pick up electrolytes and trace minerals that have been provided to your bloodstream from food sources. More relevant to chronic dehydration, though, is the question, how thick is your blood? Because if your blood is too thick and there's not enough water in your bloodstream, regardless of how many electrolytes or trace mineral salts that water is carrying, the lack of water reaching your brain is a foundation for this type of chronic dehydration. Almost everyone is already on a high-fat diet, whether they realize it or not. Their blood is already thick, which makes it hard for glucose and water to travel to the brain at the levels the brain requires for maximum efficiency. Your blood can also get thick when you're not getting enough hydration in the first place, when your blood is filled with adrenaline from caffeine or fight or flight. And when your liver is stagnant and sluggish, that means your liver is filled with poisons, toxins like toxic heavy metals and pathogen byproducts. Caffeine and adrenaline are dehydrating on their own, so these make it difficult to get ahead of chronic dehydration. When your blood is thick and gooey, it will not support the proper levels of glucose, trace mineral salts, electrolytes, and oxygen, meaning that brain cells become deficient easily when we're chronically dehydrated, which sets us up for burnout. Yeah, so those are the 4 big things our brains are missing that can lead to these types of symptoms. Glucose, trace mineral salts, B12, and brain hormones. And of course, there's hydration too, which includes all the other good stuff like the macro minerals and phytochemical compounds, coenzymes, alkaloids. See how all of this stuff works together. All of it works together, and we're being told to drink caffeine, and including healthy sounding things like matcha and coca leaf tea. And no, there's probably no caffeine in coca leaf. That's more like related to cocaine. That's what they chew on, these leaves down in Peru, and those are the leaves that are processed into cocaine. I don't think it has the same effect as cocaine, but what I was thinking is yerba mate. Yerba mate is caffeinated as well. So these kind of healthier sources of caffeines, they still have the same effect on the body as the kind in coffee. And being told, red wine is healthy, that eating a diet full of healthy fats, even as a plant-based person, like base it off of like avocados and nuts and seeds and peanut butter and healthy fat. Your brain is made of fat. And like, I don't want to say it's all a lie, but it's not true, right? It's not true. Your brain needs glucose, and the best source of glucose is fruit. So in my own life, I've been eating a lot of fruit, especially in the mornings, keeping my fat almost non-existent until dinner time. If I have any fat at all, it's going to be for dinner. Like last night I had some chickpea pasta. I blended a whole zucchini raw with a jar of organic heirloom tomato sauce, pasta sauce rather. And it wasn't perfect, right? But I was really craving pasta, and I was proud of myself for not eating any of the grown in the USA organic ronzoni that I had in the freezer that I'm probably just going to either chuck or give away to someone who isn't as sensitive and doesn't mind having the gluten. I just feel bad. I have like all this stuff that I'm wanting to give away in my freezer because I don't want to eat it anymore, but I also don't want to give it to anybody else because it's not good for them either. Like, whatever. So yeah, we'll probably finish up this chapter in the next episode and tie it all together, and then we'll continue moving on in the book. I'm excited that we're back into the book. I hope you listened to the episode with Dr. Campbell. That was a really good episode, so I hope you go and listen to that. And then coming up on the show, we are doing some episodes on addiction and the role all this stuff plays into addictions in the brain. That's going to be a good one. We'll even talk about like sugar addiction. We'll talk about acids in the brain. That's going to be a really good one too. And then there's a whole section in the book called Brainwashed. It's part 2 of the book. So we're finishing up in the next couple of episodes on part 1 of the book. And then we're moving into part 2, which is all about the brainwashing. So there's even a chapter on microdosing. And then there's a chapter on alcohol and caffeine. I'm looking forward to that part of the book. It's a very short part of the book, but it'll be entertaining nonetheless. But I hope you're learning a lot. And please email me. I put my email address in the show notes of most episodes. I know there's a few episodes where I probably forgot to do that, but you can find it in there. I've received a couple emails from you guys that are listening to this, and I just want to say thank you for reaching out. Sometimes it can be hard to do this podcast when you don't know who's listening because you don't hear from them, but please reach out to me. Let me know what you've learned and what your story is and how you're moving through your own health journey. Find me on TikTok too. I'm at The Kate Awakening, CAIT Awakening, The Kate Awakening. You can find me there, see my videos. I tend to pull video from my podcast for the TikToks, but I am in my pajamas and didn't put on any makeup today, and it's just dreary out. So I did an all audio episode this time, but in the future, there'll be more stuff on TikTok from the podcast. Yeah, so thanks for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.